And thanks for turning out of an evening to listen to what will be quite a wide-ranging discussion of what's happening with GCSEs. I mean, first of all, I'm going to actually talk about what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk very much about the national curriculum. As some of you may know, I chaired the expert panel reviewing the national curriculum when we made some quite radical changes to curriculum thinking. But while some of those ideas were radical, they tried to push the national curriculum back to the trajectory that it was originally on, from 1988 through 95 and 99, back towards very clear specification of the constructs, the key concepts, the key knowledge, the key requirements of the individual subjects. And as part of our recommendations, we did talk quite a lot about assessment. As some of you will know from schools, we argued that levels should be removed from the system. I'm not going to go into any of that detail, although if there are questions about it afterwards, that's not a problem. What I'm going to focus on is GCSEs and their role. I'm not going to go through, oh look, it's not an endless parade of PowerPoint slides saying, okay, and this is what's happening in English, and this is what's happening in history. It really isn't that. And one of the reasons it isn't that is if you're a history teacher and don't know what's in the new GCSEs, you're in big trouble. I mean, it's effectively that's commonplace professional knowledge on the ground. What I want to do is really get behind the changes. Why were the changes? And some of the changes I'll give an inside story to, from inside the policy community, one which doesn't appear in the press, doesn't appear in the literature or in the academic analysis. It's my perception. I mean, it was from me sitting in rooms arguing for particular things, some of which happened, some of which didn't. And the rationale for them, essentially, the evidence base for them. I'm often accused of presentations which are just really heavy on data. That's not true tonight. There are quite a lot of slides, there's a lot of text on them, but I'm going to talk about these issues of principle because I think they're just so important. We've got some new GCSEs, but the change is much more significant than I think many people realise. Also, there are some real practicalities. I mean, why 9 to 1? Why did that come about? What's the purpose of the change in grading? What might other grading systems look like? Am I happy with 9 to 1? Actually, I don't like grading systems very much at all, and I'll explain why as part of the presentation. I will deal with what we've got, what we've had. I will go into history quite a bit, actually, because I think that's really important, and also look at the future. There's more than enough to talk about in terms of thinking about what a change has been. Has everything changed on the surface, yet nothing really changed underneath? And there's a reason for why the title is that, because I go into schools and people are saying, right, okay, what's a C then? Okay, it's bringing to bear existing thinking. I go into schools and there are dozens of tracking systems in which if a child is on a track to a 5, they've got a green box. And if they're on a track to something lower, they've got a red box. I mean, I think that's really defective thinking. It's bringing over many ideas which are entrenched in the education system, which are underpinned by habit rather than by good sense in terms of the kind of sense we should take from research. I have got some stuff on international comparisons, some stuff which we will be publishing from my research group in a while, which Nikki Rushton and Jill Elliott have kindly allowed me to put into my presentation. So who am I? Well, thank you very much for the biog. The research group in Cambridge Assessment is about 40 people, about 120 in the organisation as a whole, and we coordinate the work of those researchers. Cambridge Assessment itself is a non-teaching department of Cambridge University, so it is part of the university. And the 2,000 plus people who make up the organisation actually work across 170 countries. So we have an opportunity to really get under the skin of education systems and understand their differences. And we develop theory and practice in comparing systems. And I want to situate GCSE internationally as well as domestically in terms of our history. So I'll do historical analysis, structural analysis, by which I mean where does GCSE sit within our curriculum and assessment theory? Where does it sit within our provision in the UK? International comparison, there is some detail that changes, and examination of possible futures. And where we go from here, I'm not saying the government's going to change GCSEs tomorrow. That absolutely is not the case. In fact, unusually, a government listened to us in 2010 when we said that it is the endless changes in qualifications, which we've seen over the last 30 years, which have created real stresses in the system. Stresses which are live in the classroom, as you have to throw away all your old notes, as you have to discard expensive textbooks and other resources. They've created stresses on exam boards in terms of setting and maintaining standards, and put stress on the education system as a whole in terms of progression, and the economy as a whole in terms of employers and parents understanding qualifications. I mean, we have had an incredible change in qualifications, and I'll explain to some extent why that's been the case. There is a reason for it, it's not arbitrary. So in talking about futures, I'm talking about what research might tell us might be sensible in the long term. So here's a bit of history. I mean, the fact is, an awful lot of people left school before there was a CSE without qualifications. And they left to go into the labour market, where there was a fairly vibrant labour market for people without high levels of general education. And it was when we had the Ruskin speech and rising societal concern about the changes in the economy, which meant that these young people were at risk, which led to the idea of ROSLA, raising of the school leaving age, and the provision of certification which would enable progression. There's a bit of history which is not well documented around all of this. Paul Newton has been digging into this over many years in Ofqual. He buys all sorts of obscure books on eBay and Amazon, and does fantastically forensic analysis of why things happened when they happened. But there's also a really good book, actually, by a guy called Mike Kingdom, which you won't be able to find because it's always put under Kingdom with an M on the end in the library. It's always misfiled. And it's about the history of the development of A-level. There's a couple of paragraphs in there which are very interesting about the CSE. Now, people talk about the extent to which we've got too many qualifications, and during the 1990s, people spoke about we've got too many examination boards, as if they came from nowhere. Well, they didn't come from nowhere. What happened was that the A-level boards were invited to develop the new CSE qualification, and they more or less refused. So the government responded by setting up regional examination boards, which were responsible for developing the CSE. Now that has fed into a very diverse qualifications menu in this country, because of course each of those boards went in slightly different directions. There was the Southern Board, Henry Mackintosh's brilliant work from out of Southampton with David Pennycook and Roger Murphy. There was YAFE, the Yorks and Humberside Association of Further and Higher Education, which was a regional examining board, and so on and so on. So we had these new examination boards suddenly appear. So the new qualification didn't just make a difference in classrooms or in schools, it made a difference to the structural landscape of the system. It had an impact on how qualifications were created, the number of qualifications, the governance of them, who was inputting to them. There was more employer involvement in some areas than others in these qualifications. Anybody remember Mode 3? Anybody remember Mode 3? Oh, yes, Mode 3, okay. So Mode 3 was a CSE which was essentially locally designed by a school. The content was designed by the school. The modes of assessment were designed by the school, and it was administered by the school, overseen by an examining body. And, can you believe that in the current context of national regulation? They were there, mowed through. They were national qualifications, the CSE, with notionally national recognition, but with this very local flavour. And this is one thing about our education system which I want to emphasise. I'm not going to go into it in great depth, but our international comparisons tell us we have the most diverse education system in the world. And I'm not idly saying that. So if you think of any dimension, whether it's when kids change school, middle schools, the different reception nursery relationships, I could go on. Assessment, curriculum, size, location, local education markets. If you've got Manchester Grammar down the road, it changes your behaviour, so on and so on. It's incredibly diverse, right down to the ideas about education, and ideas about ability. Far more diverse than I would find in Finland, relatively small country, 5 million. But even in other larger systems like South Korea. So this diversity in our system is very, very important, and it is a theme which I'll pick up. So in the 1960 report, it recognised that we needed a new certificate to cope with this large cohort which would otherwise not have certification. They were academic and vocational, and it's very interesting to look at the list of technical drawing and other things that were in there. They did include Mode 3, innovative forms of assessment, with a lot of control being administered by the school. I mean, control even over deciding what sorts of assessment it would be. And Hilary Radner in the Southwest did a lot of work on regional moderation to cope with some of these innovative forms of assessment. There were combined O and CSE papers emerging in the 1970s, as it became clear that there was a necessary relationship between attainment in the O-level and the CSE. CSE did predominate in certain schools, obviously secondary moderns, and in some schools there were issues about entry. In some schools, such as grammar schools, where there was where they were concerned about some cohorts, there were tracks within those schools, something which I'll come on to. But as we read from the literature, the distinction between the O-level and the CSE and the segregation which was beginning to emerge by having these two parallel qualifications was what gave rise to the thinking which led to the GCSE being announced, somewhat to the shock actually of the education system by Keith Joseph. Because rather like Kennedy saying we'll be on the moon in the next 10 years, Keith Joseph said it's going to be criterion referenced and it's going to come quickly. And everybody thought, how can we deliver that new qualification as quickly as is suggested? But I want to also look at some of the structural things around this. I mean, what did it do to the behaviour of schools? Where do we place qualifications in our curriculum thinking? Interestingly, it led to an increasing compulsion across the system regarding entry. Schools had to use the local CSE board. I mean, if you were in Hull, you couldn't use the Southern Regional Board's CSEs. Now that's interesting. That's compulsion of a kind which we didn't see before in respect to qualifications. There was increasing diversity in the examination forms of content, as I've described, and this meant increasing complexity in provision and governance. Who was saying what should go into the qualifications suddenly increased dramatically. And 15 CSE boards, and then there were the established O-level boards and A-level boards. There was, as I say, segregation regarding certification. The CSE was particularly allied to school type. When we had the 44 Act, we had essentially a tripartite system of technical grammar, grammar and secondary modern. There were quite a few technical grammar actually, and they persisted right the way through to the 1980s, but they were never realised as a kind of a third vocational route. And it was for the qualifications themselves to provide vocational options, which were then taken principally in the secondary modern schools. Now, you could say, okay, it was great that we introduced the GCSE, and as many external analysts say of the English system, it was a great leap forward in terms of a more unified system, which enabled the idea of a common pathway through general education, cutting into the idea that there's a segregated system. But let's hang on a minute. When around the world, we have very high-performing segregated systems. And Singapore is a very segregated system. There's a 3-track system from 11. There's an integrated route for high achievers where they don't even take the equivalent of GCSE because it's considered just a waste time. Just get on with some learning and go to the highest level, the highest, equivalent of A-level, and concentrate on a nice continuum of learning from 11. There's the middle track, which is very much the normal route, and it's referred to as a normal route. And then there's another track for children who are struggling in general education, and it has a more vocational focus. Very few people know about the Netherlands. That's segregated from 11 into a vocational track and a general educational track. From 11. I mean, 11, there are the VBO schools, which are vocational in focus. But if you look at the Dutch national curriculum, there is a great deal of general education in that vocational route, contextualised in a vocational setting. And until recently, the equity outcomes were very, very good in the Dutch system. So a very segregated system, but very good equity. That's a bit of a conundrum. We don't think that way in England at all. So maybe the segregation comes from other things that we do, or other things that we think. Unified systems, Scotland, that's done well in terms of reducing the impact of social background in higher education, but they are beginning to worry about the way in which social background is beginning to determine educational attainment. And Finland has a very unified system and does very well in terms of equity, although not so good in terms of gender, actually. And then we've got this interesting issue, because most people stop there and they classify systems according to being unified or segregated. But actually, of course, you can have loads of covert segregation in systems. You will never be good enough on the basis of your Key Stage 2 score to do higher tier mathematics. So we'll put you onto this reduced curriculum route, and lo and behold, you only know enough mathematics at the end of a number of years to do the lower tier qualification. You see, there are certain forms of segregation which become self-fulfilling prophecies if you run them in particular ways with particular views. And often these are covert forms of segregation. Just think about who's doing languages and how many they do. And that those covert forms of segregation in terms of examination entry in our system are very, very important. And we can see them at the board because we've got an overview of the examination statistics. They're alive and well in our system. I would say England is chock full of covert segregation, despite a rhetoric of being a unified system. And it's also present in the American system. So let's just go back a bit. GCSE announced sort of in the mid-80s and was from 95 really stimulated very significant changes in the system. The grading, let's pick up this grading issue. It was pass-fail in the O-level originally in CSE. And then it was changed to A to E and U ungraded. CSE was 1 to 5, with grade 1 being an O pass equivalent. I'll just flip now to the current system, because people have said, well, 1 to 9 makes no sense. Well, we made sense of that. But, interesting, that was 1 to 5. We've got 1 to 9, all the way around. The reason we got it the other way around, and this is a story from inside the governance process, is it was going to be 9 to 1. Because people say, well, 1, that's clearly the top grade. And so I said, well, what are you going to do in terms of getting points out of that for performance tables. And they said, well, we'll convert 9 to 1 to 1 to 9. Okay, it'd be that simple. And I said, yeah, and therefore hundreds of mistakes will be made in the system, in data entry. And how long do you want these GCSEs to run for? Well, yeah, the politicians, when asked that question, said, right, you're asking a question about what stability we should have in the system. We want stability. We know schools are fed up with change. We know it undermines the processes which we use for monitoring standards and maintaining standards. So we want stability. I said, well, okay, change it to 1 to 9 then. Because there may come a time, if the GCSE impacts on the system beneficially, if we improve teaching, and if the national curriculum has a beneficial effect, that we might want something above 9. And we don't want it to be 1 star or 1 star star. Okay? So there was talk with GCSE of A star with distinction. Now, how intelligible is that? So we managed to shift it round, and I think it was the right thing to do. People have been confused about it, but it's not that confusing, surely. It just needs a good communication strategy around it. And that we've not been very good at. Now, this remained a concern. If you're worried about segregation in terms of GCSE, CSE, O-level and CSE, there was still the case that a lot of O-level candidates were failing to gain a pass. That's where double entry began to really arise in a load of schools. Not very efficient, problematic in terms of exam timetabling. Remember, the CSEs were local examinations, whereas the O-levels were national, so the curriculum articulation between the two was not good. And gave rise to again, covert routes in the schools, difficult, well, which materials do we buy? And there were ceiling effects in terms of the CSE top grades. So if you were only entered for CSE and you were really good, you got the top grade, but you could potentially have been capable of getting a great deal more. And there were standard setting, standards maintenance issues. So along came GCSE, and with it came a consolidation of the boards. And that was fundamentally because these very small boards were struggling. They were struggling in some cases with the administration, and in some cases they were under enormous financial pressures. So there was a period of amalgamation and mergers. That's why indeed OCR is in Cambridge, but has got Oxford in the title. Oxford and Cambridge and RSA. The initial grading was A to G, and then A star was introduced in 1994. And from 2005, there were massive changes. I mean, I don't know who thought modularisation of GCSE was a good idea. I've yet to find out who thought it was a good idea and put it all in train. It just kind of happened. And once one board had run with modularised GCSE, because A-level had been modularised under the Deering Review, and Curriculum 2000 had been introduced, it seemed like a good idea. It wasn't. They're much smaller qualifications. And it introduced all sorts of problematic artefacts into the assessment, and all sorts of game playing, which was it really troubles me that. If a teacher is under pressure to begin to do things other than think about how to maximise the learning of a child, and to actually play around administratively with the qualifications, it's a waste of time compared with actually getting on with, this vital job of just maximising the learning. And I think modularisation was a big historical mistake in respect of GCSE. It's a controversial position, but boy, I'm sticking to it. It didn't last long, of course. There were shifts in the balance of the forms of assessment, so we had some GCSEs with very high levels of coursework, and the high levels of coursework were partially stimulated by the fact that if you were an awarding body, you only had certain percentages that you could go for. There were really only 3 categories, and it pushed some boards to say, well, that's too little, but that's a lot, but we'll go for that. So you had 60% in some English qualifications. And that gave rise to problems of standards maintenance. And because of high levels of teacher-based assessment in some qualifications, in an unusual historical context, i.e. of lots of targets, lots of external pressures, lots of accountability, lots of we've got to get the maximum grades we can out of these qualifications, that put a lot of pressure on teachers in respect of coursework. And controlled assessment was one way, Ian Colwell's brilliant work on trying to change the assessment only in order to try to reduce the huge sort of pressure that we had for the distributions to be distorted in relationship in the controlled assessment versus the distributions we were getting in the written examination. So if you had this distribution in the written examination, you'd have this distribution in terms of the controlled assessment, in terms of the coursework rather. And with controlled assessment, we wanted to push it back, so there was a good correlation between the two, because notionally there should be. There was a lot by this stage, that had been stored up in the GCSE, which was problematic. But I want to stop for a second, because you probably read stories and you've heard politicians say, the next thing we need to do in the education system is get rid of GCSE. Because after all, everybody stays in education. So what's the point of having all this stress associated with high-stakes qualifications at the age of 16? And they look around the world and they say, we're really unusual, so we must be wrong. I'm afraid there's an awful lot wrong with all of that analysis. It's naive and inaccurate in terms of international comparisons. I believe the idea of removing GCSE being politically attractive to some people is because it's associated with performance measurement and accountability, which generally is unpopular and difficult. So it makes getting rid of GCSEs an attractive political possibility. I think it's completely the wrong thing to do. And in fact, the international comparisons tell us, rather than being exceptional in an adverse way, we're slightly unusual in a very good way. And I'll explain why I think that. Let's just think about that for a moment. So GCSE was seen as a very liberating examination. It was welcomed by teachers. But assessment has got a very bad name in this country now. Talk about assessment, and if you do a word cloud, it tends to be associated with stress, pressure, and so on. Claims that we're the most assessed system in the world. It's not true at all. In fact, we've got very little assessment now. You've got a bit at the beginning of primary, you've got some, maths and English, at the end of primary school. Clutch of qualifications at 16. Look in other systems. Look at Finland, loads of testing going on. Finland, the land of milk and honey, educationally, loads of testing going on in primary schools. And I mean formal tests. Interestingly, teachers administer them in order to identify in their learner groups those at risk of falling behind. So the testing is seen as a good thing because it contributes to equity. And it's seen as a good thing because these are carefully designed tests. Believe it or not, some of the teacher associations and teacher unions designed some of these tests in Finland. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine some of our union leaders saying, yes, we want some union-based testing going on in our system? Come on, it sounds mad, but there it is in Finland, in primary schools. Testing designed to support children. Recently, Nick Gibb, the Minister for Schools, said, well, one of the reasons that kids are very stressed about GCSE is they don't have enough exposure to formal examinations earlier. And do you know what? He's onto something, because that's consistent with the evidence. If you're interested in taking the SAT in America, then familiarity with the test will increase your score. That's quite important. You're just familiar with the forms of the items. And I'll come on to that in a very interesting way in just a moment. So OECD has done a lot of analysis on the link between accountability and curricula. And actually, I'm afraid, to those that say, let's get rid of accountability, accountability is associated with high-performing education systems. That doesn't mean the specific measures that we got are right. So I've written, you'll find in Tests Worth Teaching To, a paper which says that it was absolutely wrong that we stuck with 5 GCSEs, A star to C, for so long as a performance measure. For well over a decade, we knew that that was leading to neglect of the most able and the least able. It was fully documented, but government stuck with that as a measure, and I believe that was quite wrong. So we now have more articulated performance measures, and one hopes that they are driving a more balanced curriculum. Accountability is not going to go away, but we need to make sure we have the right specific measures. But the only point I'm making really is that qualifications are so associated with accountability, and so associated with the institutional pressure they give. I've made a note here, don't forget to say, Tim, the EB as a qualification. So I've been in parental consultation meetings where the school has been communicating and using a language of children taking the English baccalaureate. Nobody takes the English baccalaureate, and parents are mighty confused by this. I mean, that is a phrase that has been used in various school halls, and it's there in print in some context from school communication. Now that's clear. It clearly communicates how strongly the schools feel the pressure of the accountability arrangements, and how poor we are really at communicating with clarity to parents and to other interested parties like employers about qualifications and about accountability. Now, a bit more on structure. So why have a GCSE? Why continue with GCSE when kids stay on in education and training of some form to a much later age? Actually, they're not staying that much longer. It's crept up by a couple of years over the last couple of decades. Well, Bologna is one reason. If we want 3-year first degrees of high quality, and I must say that our 3-year first undergraduate qualifications in England are respected around the world. It is one of our key national exports, the education which we do on our soil. It's very, very attractive because it's intensive and it's only 3 years. If you go and study in some other countries, you will have to pay as a family or as an individual for 4 years, unless you get exemption from that first general year. So the reason we've got 3-year degrees is that we have very specialist 16 to 18 education, which is of very high quality. A-levels are good, and Ofqual has done very good international comparative analysis. They're good qualifications. They stand up very well to international scrutiny. They are important precursors to 3-year degrees. If we did not have A-levels, then we would need 4-year degrees. How do we know this? Well, let's look at America. You have 4-year degrees, you have preparatory general year, but if you do the AP, the Advanced Placement Award, you can gain some exemption towards that first year. Look at the AP examinations, and they're just like A-levels. They're subject-based. You tend to take 3 or 4 of them. They are A-levels. They are A-levels. But they're only taken by certain kids. Equity issues, segregation. So it's good, I believe, that we have specialism, which gives people excellent mathematics, enable them to go into mathematically literate degrees of only of 3 years duration. There are a number of reasons why I think it's good. It's quick. Kids learn a lot when they're young. And let's just look. Who pays for that? And who pays for that? And if they're 4 years long, who's going to be paying for it? That's a very important issue. And I don't want to increase individual and familial debt. So we need some form of certification at the end point of when people stop studying particular things. Boy, we need GCSEs. I mean, we really do. And the international analysis I'll show in a moment. So the choices are increased intensity of if we get rid of GCSEs, we either need to increase the intensity of 11 to 18 education, or, maybe it's an and/or actually, increase the duration of first degrees. Now that really would be a massive change in the system. So anybody who says that getting rid of GCSEs is a quick political win, which gains the votes of schools, teachers and parents because GCSEs induce stress in kids because it's formal assessment, should be very careful about what they're actually asking for. Because they're affecting a massive change in our education system without knowing what they're doing. Now you can challenge me on all these things, but that's my view. The state carries full costing to 18, an increased duration 18 plus carried by individuals. It would be a big change. It would have an impact on all of this if we got rid of GCSE. I do think we need curriculum reform in schools. And the curriculum reform is really to say, stop saying, when people arrive at the school, and say, what's your curriculum? Showing them the list of qualification options in Key Stage 4. Because that's not the school curriculum. That's the qualifications offer. We've lost the distinction between the rich experience of the totality of the school and the qualifications which are offered. And we see the qualifications being the building blocks of curriculum. And we really need to stop that. So a very wise person once said to me, and he was Stephen Spur, head of Westminster School, and he was no slouch, now retired, and Westminster is a pretty good school. He said, I don't want any of my children studying more than 9 GCSEs. If there's an area of intellectual inquiry that they want to become engaged in, which they can't do as part of their 9 GCSEs, of course we will offer it to them. It's seeing the curriculum completely the other way around. And I was at a school last night, a trustees meeting, where exactly the same view of the curriculum was being espoused. Of course we put on loads of uncertificated stuff. Of course we'll put on twilight sessions if children are interested in anthropology and sociology and politics, even though they will never study a GCSE in it. We do need to think about the curriculum in a very different way. Now, if we were to get rid of GCSE and actually have a broader curriculum to 18, so many more subjects being studied, where would the teachers come from? Where would the rooms come from? Where would the learning materials come from? I mean, think about it. Studying 8 subjects to 18? I mean, how many? It would still mean choices, so there'd still be segregation. So how many subjects would it be? 14, like Germany? I mean, the resource implications are enormous. I mean, if we want a fundamental change in our system, absolutely root and branch, in every respect, by all means get rid of GCSEs. And I don't want it to be a situation where people make that choice without knowing what the implications are. I want to see a table where the advantages and the disadvantages are very firmly laid out and compared. I can tell you, my list of disadvantages is pretty big. And it would therefore be very, very, very expensive. So, we looked at these countries, just a few. And Jill Elliott and Nikki Rushton in my team did brilliant work on this. Simon Liebus, who's the outgoing chief executive of Cambridge Assessment, and I just said, Jill and Nikki, go off and have a look. Decide what high-performing jurisdictions are, and make sure you include those. TIMSS, PISA data. Include a load of others as well, and sort out how many have got high-stakes assessment at 16. Notice the question. We didn't say things like GCSEs. That's the wrong thing to task a researcher to do. No. High-stakes assessment. And what we found was fascinating. It's a big study, done very well. These were our conclusions. UK students are not unique in having formal assessments at the age of 16. Many jurisdictions have formal assessments at the end of lower secondary education. Only 2 jurisdictions explicitly state they do not have any formal assessment at the end of lower secondary education. Now, this is not England being unique in some way. What's interesting is that a lot of them are internal assessment. And we have real problems about the consistency, fairness and equity of internal assessment. Particularly that brilliant stuff that's come out of Hamburg, which says teachers give higher grades to people who are like themselves. And we know the psychological processes which lead to that. But quite a lot have got external assessments too. And most of the remaining jurisdictions have formal teacher assessment at the end of lower secondary education. So just don't believe somebody when they stand up and say, GCSE makes us unusual and unique. It's unusual to have examinations, formal assessment, high stakes assessment at 16. Just empirically not true. So during the National Curriculum Review, something very important happened. I went out to a lot of schools and they said, Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, what do you mean national curriculum? We haven't looked at that for years. We do AQA English. We do OCR history. In other words, it was the GCSEs which determined the curriculum content, not the national curriculum. That was not true of primary schools. So we took a very, very critical decision actually when we did the national curriculum, and it's reflected in the form of the new national curriculum implemented in 2014. We articulated the primary curriculum in a year-by-year structure, showing the clear conceptual progressions in each subject. And Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 are actually remaining very general, because we knew we had GCSEs there to structure the aims and objectives of education. We argued that the expert panel argued, as part of its recommendations, that Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 should be a continuum of learning. Not a Key Stage 3 dominated by narrow exam practice. No, we don't mean that. We don't mean narrow instrumentalism. But look, if there's extended writing in the GCSE at 16, then you should be beginning to understand what the requirements are of extended writing from the age of 11, if you haven't been exposed to that in primary. That all makes a lot of sense. It's all consistent with research. We did recommend a 3-year Key Stage 4. We knew that in some cases meant choices, and earlier choices than a 2-year Key Stage 4. But not necessarily so if you differentiate the school curriculum from qualifications. But there were issues. Dominance of certificated elements, as I've described, with essentially, I like the Ofqual report, the Wilderness Years, in relationship to Key Stage 3, because, as I described, Key Stage 3 in some schools is still, a wilderness through which tumbleweeds blow. In other schools, they're beginning to wake up to the requirements of GCSE, the requirements in terms of patterns of study, extended writing, understanding of mathematical concepts, appreciation of literature, which should be occurring from 11. That's a washback effect in the GCSEs, and I think it's a good thing. But there is some narrowing in Year 9 with a 3-year Key Stage 4. It's being interpreted in some ways. There's huge variability and diversity in the system, which I've described, is showing itself in terms of these kind of practices. And in a highly differentiated response to the EB, I have taken identical schools, identical by virtue of their intake, their composition, their size, and their outcomes. And School A has said the EB is a disaster, it prevents us from doing all sorts of things, it's wrecked our curriculum. An identical school in all respects, the head says EB, not a problem. So what's going on? What's going on is poor communication about the EB and poor communication between schools in terms of the curriculum implications. This is a washback effect from accountability linked to the qualifications. So to beginning to end now, did we need to change GCSEs? Was it just an empty whim of a reforming Secretary of State? Not at all. In 2010, we stuck our head above the parapet and said we think, as an awarding body, there's something wrong with standards. Now, the trouble with this discourse is it's easily interpreted as an attack on teachers and schools. There's a problem with exam standards, and it's down to you, teachers and schools. That's not what we were saying at all. Or you could say, right, it's exam boards, because they wreck the qualifications, they reduce the requirements. We weren't saying that either. We were saying it was the times, a whole series of things. Problems derived from a complex combination of subtle factors. Was there a problem with drifted standards during the 1990s? Well, first of all, what do we mean by standards? So we defined that. And in 2011, that at Ofqual, Gove announced his intentions for reform of the GCSEs. And there's been a lot of work, 11 on monitoring of standards, international benchmarking, revising the balance of measures to maintain standards, and new approaches to standards of maintenance in times of change, which is my final slide. But what do we mean by standards? Well, when a journalist talks about exam standards or standards in terms of GCSE, actually they'll often talk about different things even in the same paragraph. Let's just spend 2 minutes on it. What the exam asks people to do in terms of requirements, the areas of the curriculum that it covers, because you could say the standards have slipped because there's more stats these days in maths rather than mechanics. Okay? Standards of attainment, which is what kids can actually do, the things they actually do when they write an exam script. And then they're not the same. They're different standards. So you could have slippage in that, but no slippage in that. And vice versa. They're not, of course, they're not completely independent, but they behave differently. Then we've got standards over time. As subjects become easier or more harsh. The different Englishes which you can take, they're not equivalent, or they are. And physics is harder than psychology. Should they be the same? No, actually, by the way, but I won't go to that. Standards between types of qualifications, vocational academic being typical, and then underneath that, what's actually going on in the education system. And the trouble is that when people talk about standards, they often talk about all of those things without really differentiating them and sometimes confusing them. So what we said in the standards debate, which was very controversial, was that we said a whole range of factors resulted in a diminution of standards. Now, there's multiple sources of weak evidence for standards in examinations having gone down in a period 1970 to 2010, which was when we did this research. The reasons why standards are being held now statistically, but in a very particular way. A whole series of reasons and weak evidence, but some of those are very good sources of evidence. So the Aston and Coventry study, for example, looking at all undergraduates on degrees that require mathematics, a standard test issued over 20 years. Over that 20-year period, what had been a C grade in A-level mathematics became an A grade. Now, and then there were about 20 or 30 sources of evidence that we used, and these were our conclusions, so I'm not going through the analysis. There had been a period of constant change in structure and content. So again, the introduction of statistics as an option rather than mechanics in A-level mathematics, and loads of students and schools migrating to the statistics option. Removal of bias, enhancement of accessibility and transparency of examinations. Now, I'll skip to that. This is a brilliant question. It's been collected out of an archive in Cambridge, our archive at Cambridge Assessment. We've got exam questions going back to the 1890s. It was extracted by Professor Mark Warner and a group of postdoctoral students under the guidance of Lisa Jardine Wright. It's a very good physics question. And what we would have done to that question during the 1980s and 1990s is added a diagram to make it more accessible. But people would still have had to have remembered bits of maths. Then we gave them the maths, and then after that we broke it down. And that's what we've done to physics. We thought we'd taken the maths out of physics, but it turned out we'd taken the physics out of physics. Now you make those changes every year to make them just a little bit more accessible, because you're a bit worried about the people who got the lower grades but could have got a higher grade if only the question had been a bit clearer to them. You do that in 1 year and it's a not really a noticeable difference. Do it over 10 years and you've got a big change going on in terms of the ease of the qualification, not only its accessibility. So these questions are now made available, and they're made available with hints, which is good because online, because the question remains hard and demanding in a good form. You have to theorise the physical system. There's no diagram. There is a diagram when you get down to a particular hint. Even the most able students want a hint because otherwise they panic that they might not have quite understood the question. And by the way, this question is from 1923.
Where is that available?
On Isaac Physics, on the Isaac Physics website. The great thing about this, in terms of my argument about we're not the most assessed system in the world, is that I argue we need loads more assessment of the right kind, and I think this is the right kind of assessment, and it prepares people for examinations. 150,000 hits a day now on this. And bearing in mind that physics is not the most popular A-level, that's pretty good. So, accessibility, a good thing, or is it? Because how does that influence your teaching? You know, the key thing in physics is to move from a description of that to a conceptual understanding of the physical system. Now, if you give that to kids, they're not going to do it anymore, because they're going to expect the diagram in the textbook, in the exam, in the teaching, in the revision notes. They're not going to be doing that anymore. So accessibility has, I think, a history of laudable aims and dire consequences. Benefit of the doubt. So every year you say, oh, that kid could have just got that grade. Okay? So, okay, yeah, okay. Marker says, okay, well, okay, one more mark. Oh, and now they don't know the grade boundaries. Of course they don't. But actually, if you're a marker and you've been marking for 20 years, you've got a very good idea. So there's a kind of this candidate screwed up on a couple of questions, but they really are a C candidate. I can tell, I can sense it from the script. But of course, that then becomes an exemplar script for the next year. Oops, you've got a ratchet. We've got rid of a lot of that stuff through the form of training and statistical monitoring that we now do. But it was there before. Increased support by mark schemes and textbooks, that's a good thing. Knowing how to optimise your score. Emphasis on inclusion, accessibility, all of this stuff. Of course, a lot of focus on exam performance, narrow drilling, not good learning. Modularisation allowed game playing, so that actually leads to a reduction in standards, because it's not about real attainment, it's about just cashing things in an optimum way. Changing cohorts and subject choice. Oh, we don't want those kids on that geography A-level. Oh, that'll really pull our results down. That's happened. Just think about the number of teachers who 20 years ago would have taken a punt on a child. Yeah, we trust them, even though they had lousy O-level results. They'll come good under my guidance. Now, you need a B. Massive investment in education. That's a good thing. I mean, we've invested massive in education, so you would expect the standards to rise in terms of underlying attainment. So you'd expect the curve to, oops, sorry, you're looking at me this way, you'd expect the curve to go that way. But some of those things are good, some of those things aren't. They are inflation, as opposed to genuine improvement. And actually that's what the Bank of England says. When the pound goes up, it's a combination of two things. Increase in real value, and a bit of inflation in there too. And that's what we thought was going on here in this system. So we think we needed to call the time on standards, and we did. And it was a very brave thing for Simon Liebes to have sanctioned, and boy, we caught it in the press. But do you know what Michael Gove said in 2011? He said in that speech, but for the standards debate, I would not have been politically able to launch a reform of GCSEs. Now you may think that's a bad thing, but actually it was very interesting. Having a public debate about standards allowed some, in my view, some truth-telling about standards maintenance and standards over time. Because ultimately, if you have got a real diminution in the content of qualifications in the way in which I'm describing, you are selling kids short. And you are reducing the amount of knowledge, skills and understanding going forward into society and the economy. So to finish, why didn't Gove just say, well, B's the new C? I mean, that would have been easy. And maybe politically that would have been a more sensible thing to do. Maybe it would have been easier for schools. But the next slide will suggest otherwise, I think. Because when you think of what has been done, you might be able to see what was needed. So those of you in schools will know that we've got different tranches. First examinations were this summer, and all subjects will be transformed by 2020. I've got about 5 more minutes, is that okay? Started late. You'll know about the Wolf Report and the fact that some schools leapt to the top of the league table just by doing different qualifications. I mean, you can't tell me those schools were transformed overnight in terms of their learning. That's not what happens to schools. I think she was right. There was game playing going on. Our evidence was that GCSEs are very, very determined by school choices made for pupils, whereas A-levels, it's the other way around. So I worry about GCSE options. There is a reduction in subjects that went on in the GCSE changes. So humanities went, performing arts went, expressive arts went, catering qualifications went. I'm not sure they're a huge loss. In terms of the stuff that's in them, you will find that stuff in other GCSEs. But it did do damage to some schools' curriculum offer, and they found it difficult to recover from it. But I don't think that was a huge problem. Entry patterns have changed. An immediate removal of the January session, and there has been, I mean, I can't deny it, there has been narrowing of the curriculum in many, many schools. We don't know how many. We haven't done that work, but it's certainly out there. But I don't think it's for good reasons. I mean, and it's down to poor communication and understanding of the impact of the EB. But that has happened. I think it's a regretful collateral. Structural changes, modular was withdrawn. That was good. I think that stopped gaming. I don't think it should ever have been done. And there was a reduction in tiering, and I think that is good. I think the reduction in tiering has meant there's been less, oh, you're on that route, therefore we'll teach you a reduced curriculum. But for measurement purposes, it's sensible to retain tiering in some qualifications, and it was retained in mathematics. Fat maths was introduced. Liz Truss was very, very interested in that, and I think she was right to try to increase the demand of mathematics at GCSE, but we have got a problem of those that don't achieve grade C. Forcing them to go on to achieve it post-16, they often get the same or a worse grade. So we've got to reconsider just that blanket requirement of getting GCSE C equivalent by 19. There was wholesale review of the content because our analysis here showed that there was something fundamentally wrong with the drift of the way in which we'd managed GCSE. There was a lot wrong. Assessment format and balance has changed. Science coursework. I'll just spend 2 seconds on that. So when I argued that we should remove coursework from contributing to grading, the Learned Society said it'll destroy practical science in schools. And they were implacably opposed to it. The reason we said from Cambridge that it should be removed is we thought it was an unconscionable tension on teachers. You know, it's just not right to professionally compromise teachers so much, to say, yeah, you are responsible for maximising the grades in your school, and you've got to operate as an independent arbiter, an agent of an exam board, and will be paid so to do. You know, that's wrong. That leads to an impossible professional contradiction. And of course it will play out differently in different places. So it'll have terrible effects in terms of your your analysis of the data. So I think we were right to take coursework out of contributing to the grade and right to continue to retain the requirement that schools do practical work. And 400 monitoring reports we've done say that it's welcomed by kids and welcomed by teachers. Look, I can actually do the experiment wrong and learn from that for the first time. And Abrams and Rice analysis shows that that was not the case with controlled assessment. And the learned societies have come around. And it's been considered as a model for computing science. There has been an increase in extended response items, which again has put pressure on kids to write more complex text. The mark schemes have changed. They've really focused on core content. But there is real complexity in the objectives, and I want that to be looked at. You know, examining boards are having to deal with questions which are supposed to meet 4 or 5 different assessment objectives. That doesn't work in assessment theory. And I've looked at scripts. It's all over the place. That has to change. But that would be a good change. We wouldn't change GCSEs in terms of their form, their structure, their balance. They'd just be better at measuring. I've talked about grade 1 to 9, supported by comparable outcomes, which I'll finish on. Cost, right, this has been really expensive for exam boards. Really, really expensive. There's been no increase in fees, but there's been a reduction in fees to awarding bodies. Simon Liebers was very clear. He said, we didn't want the 8% extra that we got in income from modular A-level and modular GCSE. But of course, once you've got that 8%, it really hurts when it's just taken away overnight. That's true of any, just imagine a family budget. You would get used to something, it's very difficult to adjust. That's true of the exam boards too. We had to employ people to run these complex modular things. You can't just sack them on a Monday morning. The new GCSEs have changed behaviour. Increase in requests for special arrangements, inquiries on results, about results, and appeals. I think that probably would have happened anyway. It was on an upward trajectory. But it really has increased in the context of linear qualifications, where you don't get signals from modular early scores, and it's a big bang, and you don't get what you thought would get. And that's costly. It's costly for schools, it's costly for exam boards, it's costly to the taxpayer. The system is much more regulated. GCSEs from 2011 exist in a context of off-qual regulation, which GCSEs did not exist in when they were first introduced. And there's therefore been a retrenchment of offer, OCR pulling out of MFL, for example. So here's the future, the last slide. So comparable outcomes has been used for standards maintenance. Now, I won't spend ages on comparable outcomes, but it essentially means that you preserve the rank order in relationship to a key question. What would this child have got if they'd taken one of the old GCSEs? If they had the prior Key Stage 2 score. So that gives you a distribution, it gives you a rank order, and you take the marks from the new GCSEs and you give the grades to the new, on the new qualification on the basis of that distribution. It's called cohort referencing. It's not criterion referencing, it's cohort referencing. If you don't understand that, we'll do some questions on it. It is a bit tricky to understand. But essentially, the proportion getting the same grade on the basis of their prior scores will be preserved. Now, it gives benefit of the doubt because with the new GCSEs, you always expect the performance over the cohort to drop because the schools and the pupils and the parents are getting used to the qualification, and then the performance comes back up again. And that was a ratchet in the old GCSE. Every time we changed the GCSE, you got a dip, but you held the standards the same, so actually, you got a step. So the repeated change in the qualifications was a ratchet to reducing standards, another factor in there. So it's a good idea to use comparable outcomes during times of change. Apart from one thing. What if all the kids are doing better? What if a whole bunch at the bottom end, all the kids are doing better? And I've looked at some scripts, And I eyeball, and my researchers were going bonkers now that I'm saying this. I pull scripts and I eyeball them. And I look to see what kind of things grade G candidates could do in the old GCSEs and grade D candidates. And frankly, I used to be scandalised by it, because we were perfectly happy to give, you've got a GCSE. Goodness me, the things they could do or couldn't do. It was a savage indictment of our education system. I mean, if I'd put those papers in front of a minister in another country, that's not good. If you look at the amount of mathematics they could do, this is stuff that they should have been really on top of at the end of primary school, and yet they're 16. Now, that's what the revisions to the GCSE were designed to do. I've eyeballed grade 1 scripts and grade 3 scripts, and actually, I've been impressed at what kids could do. Now, this raised a question in my mind: who's responsible for looking to see whether comparable outcomes is working in the way in which we actually want it to? And the answer is, in the olden days, it would have been Ofsted. In the new regime, it's Ofqual. But they're very heavily invested in comparable outcomes as a method for maintaining public confidence. And I think we need to do some pretty urgent work to see how long we want to use comparable outcomes to give standards give grades in the new qualifications. The reference test will be coming along, and Ofqual has quite rightly commissioned the development of a reference test in maths and English. I think 1 to 9 is the right way round, but I don't like grades. Because if this is the AB boundary or the 8-9 boundary, 2 kids on either side of that boundary, one of which got a 9 and one of which got an 8, are going to be more alike than kids at the top of the 8 and the bottom of the 8. And I don't think that's right. I don't like these really big gaps in a graduated scale. And I'd quite like a score. It wouldn't be a raw score, it would be the marks in physics transferred onto it wouldn't be standardised, but it would be a transformed scale. You would do benchmarking, of course, to make sure that 923 this year is the same as 923 the year before, but we could do that through all sorts of means. Technology may change assessment. Everybody says that the GCSE is going to be on screen in 5 years' time, and they've been saying it's going to be on screen for 5 years, in 5 years' time, for 20 years. It's ever receding. I think it will happen, but not as quickly as we think, and also we know that it changes everything. It won't be the same thing. Being tested on screen is not the same as being assessed on paper, and there's some good things. We might have adaptive assessment, so we could get rid of tiers. That would be a very good thing, because that would have a good curriculum washback effect. Accountability is seen as a villain, but actually, as I said, it's a necessary feature of developed systems. So whatever we do in the future, we will still have accountability associated with assessment. I've argued that the curriculum assessment distinction needs to be asserted more strongly. We've got to stop thinking that the GCSE is the curriculum, is the building block of the experience in Key Stage 4. And I think the number of GCSEs taken per student may reduce if we think of better managing this curriculum and assessment balance. So there we are. The thing really to emphasise is that, yes, by comparable outcomes, wherever it is, somewhere in there, by comparable outcomes, we've actually taken over the old standards into the new qualifications. So in one sense, nothing's changed. If you would have got a C with a particular Key Stage 2 score in the past, then you will be given the C equivalent in the new GCSE. So hey, nothing's changed. So why have the new qualifications? The answer is an awful lot has changed and continues to change. And there are some things that we might change for the better, like this, in the future, if we think that they have educational benefit. There we go.
really glad we filmed that. There's so much content. I'm looking forward to going back over it and having a look at some of those things again. But really interesting. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, it's a sort of general question, and I apologise if you've covered it sort of somewhere. What is the basic belief that GCSE is measuring? Is it measuring knowledge, or is it measuring sort of aptitude and skill? Because when you listen to I'm just saying, because when you listen to the press,
sure.
And they say, oh yes, well the grades are going up because the teachers are wonderful and the kids are so well taught and they're getting so good. Now my background is sort of genetics and evolution and stuff.
Yep.
And, you know, humans are humans, we are not getting cleverer. So I don't believe this thing that suddenly, well, of course 50% of people are getting an A star now because everything is wonderful. And I thought, in my naivety, that the point of graded exam results was to facilitate employers selecting people with the best aptitude for whatever world they were going into. Now, I don't know if that was, maybe I just invented that and nobody ever intended it to be like that.
That's a great question. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's a wonderful question. So some people would be absolutely scandalised by the assumptions in what you've said. Very interesting.
Sorry.
And isn't it interesting that would be the case? So first of all, I mean, Helena Badsey is absolutely wonderful. And for example, the way in which our working memory, was formed as we roamed the savannah. And boy, it ain't changed. It's an executive function, pretty determined. If you're stuffed with a particular genetic composition by the age of 7, it will become clear in your learning, and you will have to work hard to overcome some of the problems that it gives you. That's absolutely right. Jane Mellanby is brilliant on this. Her book with Katie Theobald, Evidence-Based Education. Fantastic. But that's not a counsel of despair, even though some people would actually say that it is, and you need to deny all of that stuff. No, you don't need to deny it, you need to take it on board. Absolutely. There are a couple of things. Firstly, I do teach some very, very complex concepts to children at a very, very early age. So one of the problems with our national curriculum is that it suggests, for example, that particulate theory should be taught at a particular age. But actually, it's a standard, so kids need to understand it fully by that age. They need to be exposed to the idea of the particulate nature of matter much, much younger. So our national curriculum is not good in that regard. In fact, no national curriculum does that well. So I work with very young children, 4 upwards, with some very, very complex concepts, electrical fields, the idea of metaphor, and so on. And these typically are taught much older. One very interesting thing, the Uncle Albert books were produced by the Open University to explain general relativity, pitched originally at 14-year-olds. Well, after 10 years, they found they were getting very intelligent questions from 7-year-olds. Now, this is important because we know that intellectual challenge can be increased through exposure of children. I don't expect kids to understand, I don't understand what an electron is. I really don't. But I can understand that at some level, it is the thing which explains the electrical charge and the amount of electrical charge, and therefore some of the electrical properties. And you can teach that at a very early age. So we can do all of that stuff, and we've increased the challenge a lot. Now you said, are qualifications like knowledge or skills, you said knowledge, aptitudes, and skills. The answer is yes. And people say, well, aptitudes? Well, yeah, you have to be pretty motivated to get a high grade. You had to have worked hard. You had to have applied yourself. So there are elements, even though it's not explicit, of aptitude in the context of formal examinations, which look as though they're purely about knowledge. We did try and increase the amount in our country. We tried to increase through the balance of assessment, which I outlined here, assessment, format and balance, and particularly in relationship to CSE. Back here somewhere. There we go. I did talk about shifts in the balance of forms of assessment. That there were very explicit theory-driven attempts to increase the amount of skills and application through the tasks in the assessment in CSE, and that was carried forward into GCSE. But that does lead to forms of assessment which are very difficult to regulate and create all sorts of issues of trust, cost, complexity, and they have been reduced. To finish, I mean, I think that, sorry, one point and then I'll finish. I think this idea that it is either knowledge, aptitudes or skills is often based on a very naive notion of human performance. So if we examine the breakdown in many complex human tasks, medical diagnosis, landing a plane, driving a car, working on some bit of kit, whether that's domestic or industrial, breakdowns in performance or accidents are often explained by a breakdown in knowledge and its application. And knowledge is intimately wrapped into competence. So it's right that we assess knowledge. It's right that we understand the concepts that children are developing. Your final point was, what do they communicate? The answer is that Paul Newton has identified over 20 purposes of national assessment, and Mike Coles and I have identified over 40 purposes of qualifications, only a few of which are to do with making an inference about what that person can do, or saying, I'm going to take that person because they're at the top end. But what they should be is valid and reliable. They should make a claim, and that claim should be based on thorough measurement. A clear statement of what you're designing to measure, and a good measurement of it, at the construct base of the qualification. We've begun to drift in all of that, I think, in the mid-90s, in terms of GCSE. Now, I think the new GCSEs are much better in that regard, much clearer, although there's still this problem that the things that you described, knowledge, aptitudes and skills, are in these complex objectives. So I'm afraid there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between this question testing this thing. In science, you'll find long questions, a stimulus. A real one would be, Jenny is growing some strawberries. Jenny holds a basket of strawberries, it turns out. And then there's 5 questions to do with this rather odd context. And they're designed to assess various dimensions of knowledge and skill and application. And it actually, in some cases, I think, compromises the measurement in the assessment. And we've got to improve that.
Anybody?
First of all, thank you for explaining the ambition behind GCSE.
Right.
How big is it? I've been involved in the coal face,
Yes.
leading the marking of new qualifications. And my concern is the way in which getting rid of tiering has led to various consequences that we had expected.
Yeah.
We've got exams that do, I think, differentiate very successfully now, producing the kind of range of marks that we didn't see at GCSE, but we're having difficulty finding assessors who can cope with that.
Yes, indeed.
And then the big issue is comparable outcomes.
Yeah.
Because of its influence on grading.
Absolutely.
So my question is really where you see grading moving after comparable outcomes. We move beyond the comparable outcomes, how can we grade exams more effectively?
It'd be a really good idea to pay attention to what kids are actually doing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's a really
That's what we're not
technical
doing.
matter.
We're just looking at the statistics.
I think Ofqual and the boards would say not entirely, but I would say largely, heavily determined by it. But for a good reason. There was a real concern about maintaining standards for the integrity of the system, public confidence in the system, not letting kids down, with schools that were finding it difficult to adapt to new qualifications and so on. Those were all laudable reasons. But it ought to be treated as a jolly handy technique for getting over a difficult period. There's a time when you should say, and we're going to stop with this very strong emphasis on comparable outcomes in my view. There's a risk that we won't, because it's jolly handy and easy.
And it's of course who have to make the decision in the end.
They do. They do. So I've argued that there should be I argued with Glenn Stacey, who was very receptive, and Amanda Spillman, now both no longer involved in Ofqual, that there should be a public statement about how long comparable outcomes will be used for and an annual review. And I think they were quite receptive to that, but that's not what's been done. It's not easy to explain, is it, to parents or to teachers? It's not easy. But I think we should. I think it's not beyond the wit of personhood to actually do that. See, I put the importance of outcomes, the things that the kids actually do. That's why I wanted to eyeball scripts. And you actually talked from your experience as an assessor. And that's about what you perceive from what it is that the kids can do. And we have got some good processes like rank ordering, paired judgment, other means of this kind for making sure that we do take the outcomes into account, human judgment, but structured in a way which it can be, as Tom Benton's research shows, as dependable as something driven by, essentially by statistics. But it's not that comparable outcomes is bad or useless, it's a good body of evidence. But it gets really bad if you run the whole system without really paying attention to the underlying attainment of children. The reference test may add, we're jury's out on that. We're a bit sceptical, and Tom Benton again has done good work to say that maths and English, scores in maths and English combined, are still only really good at telling you about maths and English. They're not really that good at telling you about other subjects, even though people believe that they are. There are plenty of countries, it turns out, when you look at the Timmins and PISA data, where that isn't the case, so it is humanly possible for them to be different. Oh dear. But I think that would be a good public debate if only we could actually explain it. and I don't think anybody's that well invested in doing that, but I really think we should do.
And I think it will hit the headlines a bit more as more subjects are reformed.
I think so. ATL lifted the lid on this, of course, about 2 years ago. It's a very good article, it's very perceptive, with really good technical understanding. And they ask simple questions: what if everybody gets better?
Yeah.
It's true.
I have one more question. I have quite a large group of Year 11s who now say to me, but Miss, don't exam very well. I can't write an exam very well, although we give them loads of practice. And I was part of that original 2000 to 2011 GCSE of, I had my ISA going in, and I knew that doing my science ISA, I had an A, and doing my GCSE, I was very confident going into it, thinking, I can't do badly now. It gave me that self-assurance, and now I have a lot of students who are feeling quite anxious about going into this massive exams, covering a lot of content.
No, I agree.
So I do completely understand the change, but I don't know how to explain it to them that it's in fact for their benefit.
Yeah. There is a change from the 1970s. You could. Well, the government at the moment, of course, is looking at unconditional offers to higher education. There's a concern about that. But you could muck up in an exam on a particular day.
Yeah.
You could misread the rubrics. You could fall apart. You could choose the wrong question. We were very interested in the number of kids. Because of, do you remember the Capulet problem? In this Shakespeare.
The English paper.
Yeah, the English paper. As part of that investigation, we looked, and we dropped everything. We looked in unbelievable detail at the data. And I said, one of the things we ought to look at, Tom, is whether we think the kids were prepared for Romeo and Juliet. And then we found a whole bunch of kids that clearly didn't study Romeo and Juliet, but they still chose the question. What's going on? The answer is, you can make mistakes, or you can do odd things in an exam. So you're right, that the stakes are really high when you can't bank anything.
Especially with the January sessions as well.
Absolutely. But, so now this is the argument, and there are lots of bits of this argument which I believe very fervently in, and I think for good reason. One is extended writing is not just about writing, it's about thinking. It's about constructing an argument. It's about knowing that this is actually a good conclusion and the result of A, B, C and D in a particular relationship. So a highly fragmented assessment where you just take bits and pieces is not the only way that you should assess. We are interested in terms of skills, integrating knowledge. We talk about this all the time. Well, how do you assess kids integrating knowledge? Extended writing is a very good way of doing it. Difficult to mark, dependably. So exam boards have reduced it over time for very good reasons. But extended writing is good cognitively. So that's the first thing. And actually I'm really worried when I look through the qualification suite and I find plenty of places where we could have a bit of extended writing, but it's not in there. And I think and kids should be prepared throughout education to write things down in a coherent way. That's the first thing. The second thing is where Isaac physics. It's a really good question. It's an exam question, but there's all sorts of support. And what we know is that kids who've done lots and lots and lots of these and had lots of support from really good teachers will not fall apart in the exam hall. And they'll be much better at choosing the right questions because they will have seen lots of them. So Nick Gibbs onto something. He was vilified in the press, saying you reduce stress by giving people more exams. What? But you do. You use the best possible questions as part of pedagogy. And if they're getting all these right, grappling with these at an age where you think, blimey, they're doing really well, they are getting feedback. They are being told that they're on track. They are getting the feedback from assessment, which is reassuring, which means they can go into that exam all assured about what they can do, even though they're being asked to do it again. Very interesting, there is an assessment model which is being explored by a group in America, whereby you don't have exams, one-off high-stakes exams. You just have testing all the time. So if you turn up for a job, hell, you get a lot of GCSE equivalent questions, because you might have forgotten it. Therefore, we don't want to employ you. There's a good, in a way, there's a good rationale for that. Okay. No, I just think if you make really good questions part of the pedagogy, as they do in Singapore, in Shanghai, in a whole series of nations, and they're carefully chosen questions, then you don't need modular assessment. The thing which worried me about modular assessment was something from Dylan William in the States. Modules actually came from America in the 1960s into higher education, into polytechnics, and then down into general education. Dylan's done a lot of work on a credit-based system in the States. And he's found what he calls a credit-based mentality. Oh, you did chemistry. Okay. What topics did you cover? Don't ask me any questions about it. I got the credit. Sorry, what do you mean? Well, I can't answer anything. I don't remember anything about it, but I've got the credit. That really is bad. That's bad for individuals, it's bad for the economy. And modules can create that kind of idea. You've done it, you've bagged it, you can forget it. And personally, I think a careful diet of modules would have been helpful at advanced level, because then universities would have had real scores to go on in their selection decisions. At the moment, they haven't. But certainly modules, probably, if you look at the list of advantages and disadvantages, deficits and benefits, you're probably more in the deficit category. So it's about that, I think. It's about making assessment intrinsic to learning.
Well, I think we've kind of got to 7 o'clock, so I don't know, Tim, whether you're happy to take more questions, but I think if there are any more questions, if you kind of come and have a chat with Tim. But thank you so much again. I think it's been really interesting.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.